Esteemed guests, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the President of New York College, Mr. Ilias Foutsis, staff and students, I would like to welcome you to tonight's bicentenary event dedicated to the legendary British poet Lord Byron, an influential representative of the Romantic movement who was keenly charmed by the struggle of the Greeks to establish a sovereign state about 200 years ago. We thank wholeheartedly the Chief of Staff of the Armed Forces of Greece, General Dimitrios Choupis, who is represented officially in our bicentennial event by Major General Dimitrios Οικονομίδης at the center of the panel. Ευχαριστούμε θερμά τον αρχηγό του Γενικού Επιτελείου Εθνικής Άμυνας, στρατηγό Δημήτριο Χούπη, ο οποίος εκπροσωπείται επίσημα στην επαιτειακή εκδήλωσή μας από τον υποστράτηγο Δημήτριο Οικονομίδη στο κέντρο του πάνελ. Let me also express our sincere thanks to Professor George Holmes, President and Vice Chancellor of the University of Bolton, and Dr. Corinne Throsby, an expert on Lord Byron and today's keynote speaker, who have traveled from the United Kingdom and Australia, respectively, in order to join us on this special event. Also, we thank you all, ladies and gentlemen, for joining us on this occasion, whereby we embark on a journey through the intertwined tales of poetry and revolution as we pay homage to Byron's remarkable involvement in the Greek War of Independence. By doing so, we honor not only Byron's legacy as a poet, but also as a symbol of hope for those who yearn for freedom. We will now proceed with the opening remarks of the event. The University of Bolton Greater Manchester and New York College have established a flourishing educational partnership over the last 15 years, offering undergraduate and postgraduate degrees in Greece through the so-called Transnational Education Scheme. According to the prestigious Guardian ranking list, the University of Bolton has established its presence as a top 30 university in the United Kingdom. Ladies and gentlemen, it is a great honor and pleasure to have with us today the President and Vice Chancellor of the University of Bolton Greater Manchester, Professor George Holmes. Professor Holmes, let me invite you to the podium for an opening remark. Thank you.
Poedri Foutsi, Agapiti Mu, Phili Kalispera. So that's it. That's my Greek over with, okay? Very simple and over with. It's a massive privilege for me to be here this evening to open this particular event, particularly because we have a very close relationship with President Foutsis and the New York College. As our colleague indicated, we are now a top 30 UK university, and we're working here in Athens to provide the best possible education to students. But I was asked to talk this evening about that great British icon, Lord Byron, and of course they've asked someone here who's not an expert. We do have an expert coming up in the form of Corinne, who will join us in a few moments. But as a non-expert, I consulted the great Google and Wikipedia to find out more. And of course, I found out quite a lot of interesting things about Lord Byron. First of all, that he and I share the same name, that is to say, George. And that's a starting point for this. Even more interesting, his title, the Baron Byron of Rochdale, is in Greater Manchester, where my university is based. And so there is clearly a close connection between George and Rochdale and our university. So it was appropriate that I was invited here tonight to talk about this, because there's an enormous similarity, in my view, between the great Lord Byron and our President Foutsis here. I've known the President for many, many years now. We've both been presidents of our own universities for many, many years now. It's my 20th year in my own university. And there's something in science called quantum entanglement, which is a connection at a sort of a microscopic level, at an atomic level. And I think that New York College Athens, President Foutsis, our university, and indeed Lord Byron are connected in that great connection between the United Kingdom and Greece. And in that sense, I looked at what the characteristics of the great Lord Byron were. And if you look at what they're saying about him, they're saying that he was a risk-taker, that he was a geopolitical strategist, that he was a humanist, that he was a visionary with high ideals, that he used his great wealth to help victims in all cases. And there we have the great President Foutsis in all those characteristics: a geopolitical strategist, a risk-taker, a humanist, a visionary with high ideals. So you have on your platform today what I believe is the quantum remains of Lord Byron in the sense that President Futsis represents those values. So they said that Byron was a great and good man. And I think that's very true about our host tonight as well. So Byron was the architect of an enduring alliance between the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland and the Hellenic Republic of Greece. And so it's with great pleasure and great honour that I arrive this evening to welcome you to the event and to hand over ultimately through the MC to our expert speaker. Thank you for listening.
Many thanks, Professor Holmes, for the opening remark. New York College started its operation in 1989 in collaboration with the largest university system of the United States of America, the State University of New York. Later on, further academic collaborations were established with public universities in Europe. Nowadays, NYC Educational Group consists of New York College in Athens and Thessaloniki, as well as the University of New York in Prague in the Czech Republic. I would like now to invite the founder and president of New York College Educational Group, Mr. Ilias Futsis, for an opening remark and visual presentation. President Futsis, the floor is yours. Πριν την έναρξη της ομιλίας του κυρίου Futsi, just let me mention that the presentation of Mr. Futsis is also available, will be given in Greek, but an English translation is available below your desks. President.
Αξιότιμες κυρίες, αξιότιμοι κύριοι. Καταρχήν, καλησπέρα σας και καλώς ήρθατε. Στο New York College διατηρούμε την πεποίθηση ότι όσοι λαοί δεν γνωρίζουν την ιστορία τους, είναι καταδικασμένοι να την επαναλάβουν. Και για μας αυτό είναι πάρα πολύ σημαντικό και σοβαρό, διότι είμαστε ελεύθεροι και ανεξάρτητη χώρα μόνο 200 χρόνια. Και αυτό είναι πάρα πολύ σημαντικό. Ως εκ τούτου, αποφασίσαμε το 2021 να μην περιοριστούμε σε εορταστικές εκδηλώσεις μόνο για την 200ετηρίδα της Ελληνικής Επανάστασης, αλλά προχωρούμε πολύ πιο πέρα, διοργανώνοντας αναστοχαστικές εκδηλώσεις καθ' όλη την 12ετή περίοδο από το 2021 μέχρι το 2033 για την 200ετηρίδα του αγώνα της Παλιγενεσίας στο σύνολό του, που άρχισε το 1821 και τελείωσε μετά από 12 χρόνια το 1833, με την απελευθέρωση της Ακροπόλεως στη γειτονιά μας. Σε αυτό το πλαίσιο έχουμε διοργανώσει περισσότερες από 12 επαιτειακές πρωτοβουλίες μέχρι σήμερα. Ας δούμε τις σημαντικότερες από αυτές σε μια σύντομη δίλεπτη παρουσίαση.
Η συμμετοχή του New York College στη 200ετηρίδα. Το New York College πραγματοποίησε επαιτειακές εκδηλώσεις στις οποίες συμμετείχαν επιφανείς προσωπικότητες. Εκδήλωση με θέμα «Ο λόγος του Κολοκοτρώνη προς τους νέους στην Πνίκα». Για πρώτη φορά ύστερα από την 7η Οκτωβρίου του 1838, ο λόγος του Κολοκοτρώνη στην Πνίκα ακούστηκε ξανά σε απαγγελία από τον στρατηγό Φράγκο Φραγκούλη, επίτιμο αρχηγό ΓΕΣ, και Κωνσταντίνο Πλαπούτα, πρόεδρο του Πατριωτικού Ομίλου Απογόνων Αγωνιστών του 1821. Ο Γεώργιος Κοντογιώργης, καθηγητής και τέος πρίτανης του Παντίου Πανεπιστημίου, κατά τον χαιρετισμό του στην εκδήλωση. Ο πρόεδρος και ιδρυτής του εκπαιδευτικού ομίλου New York College, Ηλίας Φούτσης, απευθύνων χαιρετισμό στην εκδήλωση. Διαδικτυακή εκδήλωση με θέμα «Η συμβολή του Ιωάννη Καποδίστρια στην ηθική και την εκπαίδευση». Με συμμετοχή της Ναταλίας Καποδίστρια, τελευταίας απογόνου της οικογένειας Καποδίστρια, του πρώην πρίτανη και ομότιμου καθηγητή φιλοσοφίας του Εθνικού και Καποδιστριακού Πανεπιστημίου Αθηνών Θεοδόσιου Πελεγρίνη και άλλων επιφανών ομιλητών. Εκδήλωση στο Μέγαρο Μουσικής με θέμα «Ντρέδες» στην πρώτη γραμμή της ελληνικής παλιγενεσίας, με σκοπό την ανάδειξη των ηρώων από τη Μεσσηνία. Παρουσία του πρώην Προέδρου της Ελληνικής Δημοκρατίας Προκόπη Παυλόπουλου, της Προέδρου της Επιτροπής Ελλάδα 2021 Γιάννας Αγγελοπούλου Δασκαλάκη και του Υφυπουργού Παιδείας Άγγελου Συρίγου. Επαιτειακή εικαστική έκθεση «Ο μεγάλος περίπατος της Αθήνας πριν 200 χρόνια» στο New York College Athens Campus, με εκτιθέμενα 56 αριστουργήματα μεγάλων Ευρωπαίων και Αμερικανών ζωγράφων. ο Κώστας Μπακογιάννης, δήμαρχος Αθηναίων, κατά την επίσκεψή του στα εγγένεια της έκθεσης με τον πρόεδρο και ιδρυτή του εκπαιδευτικού ομίλου New York College, Ηλία Φούτσι, και τον πρόεδρο του Ινστιτούτου Τοπικής Αυτοδιοίκησης της ΚΕΔΕ, Ηλία Αποστολόπουλο. Η έκθεση τελεί υπό την αιγίδα του Ινστιτούτου Τοπικής Αυτοδιοίκησης της Κεντρικής Ένωσης Δήμων Ελλάδος, του Δήμου Αθηναίων και του Δήμου Παλαιού Φαλήρου. Ο μεγάλος περίπατος της Αθήνας πριν 200 χρόνια, μέσα από 36 αριστουργήματα μεγάλων Ευρωπαίων ζωγράφων, στο μουσικό ρυθμό του Βαγγέλη Παπαθανασίου. Είμαστε ευγνώμονες που ο μεγάλος Έλληνας μουσουργός Βαγγέλης Παπαθανασίου εντελώς δωρεάν μας χορήγησε την άδεια χρήσης της μουσικοσυνθέσεώς του Α για τη δημιουργία του βίντεο κλιπ.
Και πρόσφατα, την 25η Ιανουαρίου του 2024, ο αντιστράτηγος Δημήτριος Οικονομίδης, ο οποίος είναι και παρόν απόψε και μας τιμά, εκπροσωπώντας τον αρχηγό του Γενικού Επιτελείου Ενόπλων Δυνάμεων, στρατηγό Δημήτρη Χούπη, εγκαινίασε την αίθουσα Λόρδος Βύρων στο κάμπους μας, στην 200η επέτειο από την ανακήρυξη του Λόρδου Βύρωνα σε πολιτικό και στρατιωτικό αρχηγό των ενόπλων ελληνικών εμπολέμων στην Δυτική Ελλάδα την 25η Ιανουαρίου του 1824. Εμείς οι Έλληνες μαθαίνουμε από μικρή ηλικία στο σχολείο τι έλεγε ο ίδιος ο Μέγας Αλέξανδρος για τον πατέρα του Φίλιππο και τον δάσκαλό του Αριστοτέλη. Αριστοτέλην δε θαυμάζον εν αρχή και αγαπών ουχ ήτων, ως αυτός έλεγε, του πατρός, ως δι εκείνον μεν ζών, δια τούτον δε καλός ζών. Δηλαδή στα νέα ελληνικά. Τον Αριστοτέλη τον θαύμαζε πρωταρχικά και τον αγαπούσε ακόμα περισσότερο από τον πατέρα του, όπως ο ίδιος ο Αλέξανδρος έλεγε, διότι σε εκείνον τον πατέρα του όφιλε το ζήν, αλλά σε αυτόν τον δάσκαλό του όφιλε το ευζήν. Με αυτό το απόσπασμα ο Πλούταρχος επισημαίνει την τεράστια συμβολή του Αριστοτέλη, δηλαδή της παιδείας, στην διαμόρφωση και σφυριλάτηση της ηγετικής προσωπικότητας του Μεγάλου Αλεξάνδρου. Ό,τι ήταν ο Αριστοτέλης για τον Αλέξανδρο ήταν το Πανεπιστήμιο του Cambridge για τον Βύρωνα. Στο Cambridge ο Βύρων εμβαπτίστη στα νάματα της κλασικής παιδείας, στην απεραντοσύνη της ελληνικής γλώσσας και στον οικουμενικό πολιτισμό των αρχαίων μας. Εκεί στο Cambridge ο Βύρων έγινε φιλέλληνας. Αμέσως μάλιστα μετά την αποφοίτησή του από το Cambridge το 1809, ο Βύρων πραγματοποίησε διετή μετεκπαιδευτική περιοδεία στην Ελλάδα το 1810 έως το 1811. Σε αυτό το πλαίσιο αισθάνομαι βαθιά συγκίνηση γιατί με την διακεκριμένη παρουσία της δόκτωρος Κορίν Θόρσμπι στην σημερινή μας εκδήλωση τιμούμε για πρώτη φορά όχι μόνο τον Λόρδο Βύρωνα ως τον σημαντικότερο φιλέλληνα, αλλά και το Πανεπιστήμιο του Cambridge, ως τον πανεπιστημιακό δάσκαλο που ενέπνευσε το Βύρωνα και σφυριλάτησε τον φιλελληνισμό του. Πρόσφατα οι φοιτητές μας τίμησαν τον Λόρδο Βύρωνα με κατάθεση στεφάνου στον Ανδριάντα του τα περασμένα Χριστούγεννα, στην 200η επέτειο της μεσιανικής υποδοχής του στο Μεσολόγγι στις 24 Δεκεμβρίου του 1823. Όπως είναι προφανές, οι φοιτητές και καθηγητές μας εμπνεόμαστε καθημερινά κάθε φορά που βλέπουμε στην είσοδο του κάμπους μας τους δύο Ανδριάντες, τον Μέγα Αλέξανδρο και τον Λόρδο Βύρωνα, οπότε συνειρμικά σκεφτόμαστε τους δασκάλους τους, τον Αριστοτέλη και το Πανεπιστήμιο του Cambridge. Θέλω να ευχαριστήσω όλους όσους μας τιμούν σήμερα με την παρουσία τους στην σημερινή αυτή εκδήλωση και ιδιαίτερα τον εκπρόσωπο των ενόπλων δυνάμεων, στρατηγό Οικονομίδη, την δόκτωρα Κορίν Θόρσμπι, η οποία διήνυσε πάρα πολλά χιλιόμετρα για να βρίσκεται σήμερα εδώ, και τον πρόεδρο και φίλο μας, George Holmes, πρόεδρο του University of Bolton, Greater Manchester, με τον οποίο έχουμε γράψει μια σημαντική ιστορία έλληνο-βρετανικής ακαδημαϊκής πανεπιστημιακής επιτυχίας. Και είμαστε βέβαιοι ότι θα συνεχίσουμε και με το καινούριο νομοσχέδιο να γίνουμε το πρώτο πάλι ιδιωτικό πανεπιστήμιο στην Ελλάδα. Και πάλι σας ευχαριστώ όλους.
Many thanks, President Foutsis. Τη σημερινή εκδήλωση τιμά με την παρουσία του ο αντιστράτηγος εν αποστρατεία Νικόλαος Πιτσόλης. Ο αντιστράτηγος εν αποστρατεία Νικόλαος Πιτσόλης γεννήθηκε το 1960 στην Κωνσταντινούπολη. Το 1964 οι τουρκικές αρχές εξανάγκασαν την οικογένειά του να εγκαταλείψει την Κωνσταντινούπολη μαζί με χιλιάδες άλλους ομογενείς. Είναι επίτιμος διευθυντής ΓΕΘΑ Ζήτα Κλάδου, νυν αντιπρόεδρος της Κιβωτού Ολιστικής Παιδείας Ενόπλων Δυνάμεων και νυν γενικός γραμματέας της Πανελλήνιας Ομοσπονδίας Στρατιωτικών. Διετέλεσε διευθυντής του Γραφείου Μελετών της Διεύθυνσης Πληροφορικής και Μελετών του Γενικού Επιτελείου Στρατού, αναπληρωτής στρατιωτικός σύμβουλος στη μόνιμη αντιπροσωπεία της Ελλάδος στα Ηνωμένα Έθνη την περίοδο κατά την οποία η Ελλάδα ήταν μη μόνιμο μέλος του Συμβουλίου Ασφαλείας του ΟΗΕ, καθώς και διευθυντής κλάδων του ΓΕΘΑ, όπως διευθυντής της Διεύθυνσης Πληροφορικής, διευθυντής της Διεύθυνσης Κυβερνοάμυνας, διευθυντής του κλάδου δογμάτων, μετεξέλιξης και προσομοίωσης και διευθυντής του κλάδου διακλαδικών στρατιωτικών πληροφοριών. Αποφοίτησε από τη Στρατιωτική Σχολή Ευελπίδων, τη Σχολή Αλεξιπτωτιστών, τη Σχολή Προγραμματιστών Ηλεκτρονικών Υπολογιστών του ΓΕΘΑ, τη Σχολή Τεχνικής Εκπαιδεύσεως Αξιωματικών Μηχανικού και την Ανώτατη Σχολή Πολέμου. Είναι κάτοχος μεταπτυχιακού τίτλου Master of Science στην Επιχειρησιακή Έρευνα και Στατιστική από το Πανεπιστήμιο Essex της Μεγάλης Βρετανίας. Είναι μελετητής της νεότερης ελληνικής ιστορίας και συγγραφέας του βιβλίου «Μία διαδρομή στα μονοπάτια των 200 ετών της σύγχρονης ελληνικής ιστορίας», ο Απολογισμός, που κυκλοφορεί από τις εκδόσεις Ινφογνώμων. Είναι τέλος ο ιδρυτής και κάτοχος της ιστοσελίδας Ελληνικά Μνημεία. Στρατηγέ, σας καλώ στο βήμα για να μας αναλύσετε τη στρατιωτική συμβολή του Λόρδου Βύρωνα ως πολέμαρχου στον αγώνα της Παλιγγενεσίας.
Κυρίες και κύριοι, εκλεκτοί προσκεκλημένοι, distinguished guests, although I speak English quite fluently, since my Greek is definitely better, as it is my native language after all, and due to the fact that the vast majority of the audience is Hellenic, I will be delivering my speech in Greek. Ο εύλογος προβληματισμός αυτών που παρακολουθούν μια ομιλία είναι η ποιότητα και η διάρκεια της ομιλίας. Όσον αφορά στη διάρκεια, μην προβληματίζεστε, η διάρκεια θα είναι αυτό που λέμε τόσο όσο. Θα ήθελα να συγχαρώ το New York College για την εξαιρετική πρωτοβουλία του να διοργανώσει την απόψινή εκδήλωση. Αποτελεί μεγάλη τιμή για μένα το γεγονός ότι βρίσκομαι σήμερα εδώ, σε αυτόν τον ιερό και ιστορικό χώρο της δημοκρατίας, σε αυτή την εκδήλωση για μια μεγάλη φιλελληνική προσωπικότητα, τον Λόρδο Βύρωνα, προκειμένου να αναπτύξω τη μεγάλη προσφορά του στις ένοπλες δυνάμεις της χώρας. Αν και το θέμα της ομιλίας μου είναι ο Λόρδος Βύρων και βέβαια η εποχή του, θα αναφερθώ παράλληλα και σε σύγχρονα ανάλογα, διότι εμείς στην Ελλάδα δυστυχώς και δεν διδασκόμαστε, αλλά και επαναλαμβάνουμε όλα τα λάθη της ιστορίας μας. Για διευκόλυνσή σας, όλες οι ημερομηνίες που θα αναφέρω είναι σύμφωνα με το Γρηγοριανό, το νέο το ημερολόγιο και αφορούν το 1824. Όπου υπάρχει αναφορά σε διαφορετικό έτος, θα γίνεται ιδιαίτερη μνήα. Θα μου επιτρέψετε να κάνω μια προσωπική αναφορά. Όπως ακούσατε, γεννήθηκα στην Κωνσταντινούπολη, την οποία το 1964 οι τουρκικές αρχές εξανάγκασαν την οικογένειά μου να εγκαταλείψει. Βρήκαμε τότε καταφύγιο σε ένα φτωχόσπιτο στον Βύρωνα, κοντά στα ομώνυμα Ταβάρια, όπου ξεκίνησε η καινούρια μας ζωή. Τι είναι ο Βύρωνας? Είναι ο Δήμος της Αττικής, ο οποίος τον Απρίλιο του 1924 πήρε το όνομα του Λόρδου Βύρωνα με αφορμή τα 100 χρόνια από τον θάνατό του. Αυτού τον οποίο τιμάμε σήμερα και για τον οποίο κλήθηκα να παρουσιάσω το έργο του. Θεωρώ αυτά τα γεγονότα ως όμορφες συμπτώσεις της ζωής. Ας δούμε λοιπόν τον Βύρωνα και τη συμβολή του στα στρατιωτικά δρόμενα της Παλιγγενεσίας. 25 Ιανουαρίου 1824, οι εμπόλεμοι Έλληνες, στρατιωτικοί και πολιτικοί, στη Δυτική και Κεντρική Ρούμελη, ανακήρυξαν τον Λόρδο Βύρωνα επίσημα και εγγράφος πολιτικό και στρατιωτικό αρχηγό των ελληνικών δυνάμεων στην εκστρατεία τους προς απελευθέρωση της ναυπάκτου και εκείθεν προς βορρά, όπως σχεδίαζε ο Βύρωνα από κοινού με τον Αλέξανδρο Μαυροκοίτου, εκπρόσωπο τότε της ελληνικής κυβέρνησης στο Μεσολόγγι. Η συμβολή του Βύρωνα στις πολεμικές επιχειρήσεις των Ελλήνων κατά ξηρά και κατά θάλασσα στον αγώνα της Παλιγγενεσίας θα αναλυθεί περιληπτικά στη συνέχεια. Πριν από 200 ακριβώς χρόνια, στις 17 Απριλίου, καθώς ο Λόρδον Βίρον ψυχοραγούσε, έφτασε στο Ιόνιο η αγγλική κορβέτα Φλόριντα, που μετέφερε την πρώτη δόση των 40.000 αγγλικών λιρών του πρώτου δανείου της ανεξαρτησίας. Στο Φλόριντα επέβαινε ο πρώην αξιωματικός του Βρετανικού Βασιλικού Ναυτικού Έντουαρτ Μπλακέρ, συνιδρυτής της Ελληνικής Επιτροπής του Λονδίνου, ο οποίος είχε οθήσει τον Λόρδο Βίρονα να εμπλακεί σε ηγετικό επίπεδο στον αγώνα της ανεξαρτησίας ως αρχιεπίτροπος, High Commissioner, του πρώτου δανείου της ανεξαρτησίας. Υπό αυτή την ιδιότητα του αρχιεπιτρόπου, ο Βίρον καλείται να πρωτοστατήσει στον διεθνή αγώνα για την αναγκαία χρηματοδότηση των ενόπλων δυνάμεων της εμπόλεμης Ελλάδας. Από εκεί την, ας μου επιτραπεί η φράση, Βιρόνια πρώτη δόση, δηλαδή από χρήματα που έφτασαν στον ελληνικό χώρο επιβίρονος εν ζωή ακόμη, το ποσό των 18.000 αγγλικών λιρών διατέθηκε στην ελληνική κυβέρνηση μετά από 3 μήνες, 1 Αυγούστου, προς άμεσο εφοδιασμό και κατεπήγοντα εξοπλισμό του ελληνικού στόλου. Ως αποτέλεσμα αυτής της χρηματοδότησης, 3 μοίρες του ελληνικού στόλου, 2 ιδραίικες και 1 σπετσιώτικη, άρχισαν να αποπλέουν πάνωπλες μετά από 4 μέρες από την Ύδρα και τις Πέτσες, τον Αύγουστο, προς ολοταχώς προς το Ανατολικό Αιγαίο ή με θορμής ακαθέκτου, όπως θα έλεγε σχεδόν 100 χρόνια αργότερα ο ναύαρχος Κουντουριώτης. Δυστυχώς, θα επισημάνω στο σημείο αυτό ότι παρά τις καλές προθέσεις, τα δάνεια αυτά και όσα δάνεια λάβαμε στη συνέχεια, σε συνδυασμό με την κάκιστη διαχείριση από τις κυβερνήσεις, μας οδήγησαν σε 7 πτωχεύσεις, από το 1827 την πρώτη, μέχρι και την τελευταία το 2010, που βιώσαμε όλοι μας. Επί 4 μήνες εν πλώ, από 11 Αυγούστου μέχρι 14 Νοεμβρίου, εκείνες οι 3 μοίρες του ελληνικού στόλου, με 70 μπρίκια και γαλέτες και 21 πυρπολικά υπό τον άβαρχο Μιαούλη, καταναυμαχούσαν στο Ανατολικό Αιγαίο τον συνενωμένο στόλο των Οθωμανών υπό τον περιβόητο Ιμπραήμ Πασά, ο Αιγυπτιακός στόλος, και Χουσρεύ Πασά, ο αυτοκρατορικός, που διέθεταν 636 πλοία συνολικά, μεταξύ των οποίων συμπεριλαμβάνονται 52 μεγάλα πολεμικά, τρίκρωτα, δίκρωτα, φρεγάτες, κορβέτες, ενώ ο ελληνικός στόλος δεν διέθετε ούτε ένα τέτοιο μεγάλο πλοίο. Εν τούτης, ο ελληνικός στόλος κατόρθωσε να προασπίσει τη Σάμο στη δεύτερη μάχη τον Αύγουστο και να αποτρέψει την απόβαση των στρατευμάτων του Ιμπραήμ Πασά στην Πελοπόννησο. Η μεγαλύτερη και πιο γνωστή από εκείνες τις νικηφόρες ναυμαχίες των Ελλήνων στο Ανατολικό Αιγαίο είναι η ναυμαχία στον κόλπο του Γέροντα, ανατολικά της Λέρου, 11 Οκτωβρίου. Επικρατώντας το Αιγαίο, ο ελληνικός στόλος ματέωσε τόσο τα τρέχοντα σχέδια του Ιμπραήμ και των Οθωμανών για καταστροφή Σάμου, Ύδρας, Πετσών, αλλά και τα μελλοντικά του. Ανάλογη δράση του ναυτικού μας θα δούμε με το θωρηκτό Αβέροφ και τον άβαρχο Κουντουριώτη με την ναυμαχία της Λίμνου στις 5 Ιανουαρίου 1913, που είχε αποτέλεσμα ο τουρκικός στόλος να μην τολμήσει να εξέλθει ξανά από τα στενά. Κάτι που δυστυχώς, και δεν επιθυμώ να ξύσω πληγές εδώ, δεν πετύχαμε στα ήμια το 1996. Οι καταστροφές της Κάσου και των Ψαρών, Ιούνιο-Ιούλιο, πριν προλάβει ο ελληνικός στόλος να χρηματοδοτηθεί από την αναφερθήσα πρώτη δόση, λόγω προσωρινών πολιτικογραφειοκρατικών κολλημάτων που προέκυψαν και μετά και εξαιτίας του πρόωρου θανάτου του Λόρδου Βίρονα στις 19 Απριλίου, καταδεικνύουν το τραγικό κόστος που είχε για την Ελλάδα ο πρόωρος θάνατός του. Εάν ο Λόρδος Βίρον ζούσε έστω για 1 μήνα ακόμα, ώστε να προλάβει ο ίδιος να διαθέσει αμέσως και γέρος την εν λόγω πρώτη δόση στον ελληνικό στόλο, παρακάμπτοντας ως αρχιεπίτροπος οποιαδήποτε πολιτικογραφειοκρατικά κολλήματα, τότε μπορούμε εύλογα να υποθέσουμε ότι και η Κάσος και τα Ψαρά θα είχαν διασωθεί, όπως αργότερα διασώθηκαν η Σάμος, η Ύδρα, οι Σπέτσες και άλλα νησιά. Ωστόσο, όπως έχει πει και ο αείμνηστος Γιώργος Δερτιλής, η ιστορία καταγράφει αυτό που συνέβη, όχι αυτό που θα μπορούσε να συμβεί. Η πολιτικογραφειοκρατική αναποτελεσματικότητα είναι γνωστό δυστυχώς και διαχρονικό πρόβλημα στη χώρα μας. Ενδεικτικά, ο Χαρίλαος Τρικούπης οραματίστηκε τη γέφυρα Ρίο-Αντίριο το 1889. Η κυβέρνηση αποφάσισε την κατασκευή της το 1965 και εγκαινιάστηκε το 2004. 115 χρόνια από τη στιγμή που το οραματίστηκε ο Τρικούπης και 39 από την κυβερνητική απόφαση. Ο Λόρδος Βίρον, ως επίσημος εκπρόσωπος στην Ελλάδα της Φιλελληνικής Επιτροπής του Λονδίνου, πρωτοστάτησε στην αλλαγή του στρατιωτικού δόγματος των εμπόλεμων Ελλήνων όσον αφορά στην πολεμική τους τακτική προς εκπόρθηση Οθωμανικών φρουρίων και οχυρωμένων πόλεων. Μέχρι τότε, οι Έλληνες εφάρμοζαν την τακτική του αποκλεισμού και της πολιορκίας, με σταδιακά όλο και περισσότερο περισφυγόμενο πολιορκητικό κλειό προς εξαναγκασμό των πολιορκούμενων να παραδοθούν, λόγω ελλείψεως τροφίμων, πόσιμου νερού και εξάπλωσης επιδημιών μεταξύ τους. Αυτή η τακτική είχε αποτέλεσμα σε κάποιες περιπτώσεις μεταξύ 1821 και 1823, όπως τα φρούρια Νεοκάστρου, Μονεμβασίας, Ακροκορίνθου, Παλαμίδη, Σάλωνα, Τριπολιτσά. Αλλά όμως είχε αποβεί αναποτελεσματική σε κάποιες άλλες περιπτώσεις, όπως τα φρούρια Πατρών, Ρίου, Ναυπάκτου, Μεθόνης, Κορώνης. Βέβαια, ως στρατιωτικός, θα επισημάνω στο σημείο αυτό ότι οι τακτικές, δόγματα και σχέδια δεν αποτελούν Ευαγγέλια και πρέπει να αναθεωρούνται με τόλμη. Θυμάμαι τα λόγια παλαιού στρατηγού: «Η ύπαρξη σχεδίου είναι σοφία. Η αιμονή σε αυτό είναι βλακεία». Ο Βύρον θεωρούσε ως επιτακτική ανάγκη για τις ελληνικές ένοπλες δυνάμεις να αναβαθμιστούν άμεσα, εξοπλιζόμενες με βαρύ πυροβολικό με πολλά βαρέα κανόνια 48-64 λιβρών, προκειμένου όχι μόνο να προασπίζονται τα κάστρα ως πολιορκούμενοι, όπως έκαναν στο Νέοκαστρο και το Μπούρτζι και στο ανατολικό σημερινό Ιτωλικό, αλλά επιπλέον να αλώνουν ταχαίως τα Οθωμανικά κάστρα ως πολιορκητές, όπως σχεδίαζαν να κάνουν το 24-25, εκπορθώντας τα εχθρικά φρούρια ταχαίως, με έφοδο, καταστρέφοντας προηγουμένως τα τείχη των φρουρίων σε συγκεκριμένα σημεία με βαρύ πυροβολικό, αρχίζοντας από το θεωρούμενο ως απόρθητο φρούριο της Ναυπάκτου την άνοιξη του 1824. Με σκοπό την ίδρυση βαριάς πολεμικής βιομηχανίας στην Ελλάδα, η φιλελληνική εταιρεία του Λονδίνου αγόρασε και απέστειλε στην Ελλάδα, με χρηματοδότηση 1.000 λιρών από τη Δημαρχία του Λονδίνου, ένα κινητό σιδηρουργείο, το οποίο ο Λόρδος Βύρον έδωσε εντολή να εγκατασταθεί στον περιτυχισμένο χώρο σε ράγη του Μεσολογγίου, με δική του επιπρόσθετη χρηματοδότηση 600 λιρών. Το σιδηρουργείο προοριζόταν για επιτόπια παραγωγή βαρέων πυροβόλων και πυρομαχικών και τελούσε υπό την τεχνική διεύθυνση του Άγγλου φιλέλληνα μηχανουργού και πρώην υπαλλήλου στη Διεύθυνση Υλικού Πολέμου της Αγγλίας, William Peary, ο οποίος συγκρότησε μια αρχική ομάδα μηχανουργών και πυροτεχνουργών από 4 φιλέλληνες και 8 Έλληνες αξιωματικούς. Εκείνο το πολεμικό μηχανουργείο, ιστορικά η πρώτη μονάδα της ελληνικής βαριάς πολεμικής βιομηχανίας, άρχισε να λειτουργεί πυρετοδός 27 Ιανουαρίου. Η προεργασία βέβαια είχε αρχίσει από το Δεκέμβριο, υπό την επιστασία ειδικού και ταυτόχρονα εκπροσώπου του Λόρδου Βύρωνα, καθιστώντας τότε τον ελληνικό στρατό για πρώτη φορά αυτάρκη σε βαρέα πυροβόλα. Είναι δυστυχώς γνωστή σε όλους η απαξίωση της ελληνικής αμυντικής βιομηχανίας με την πάροδο του χρόνου, σε αντίθεση με την τουρκική, ας πούμε. Μόλις τώρα αρχίσαμε και πάλι να ψελίζουμε για την αμυντική βιομηχανία μας. Ταυτόχρονα, ο Λόρδος Βύρον διόρισε τον Πέιρι αρχηγό του πρώτου τάγματος πυροβολικού του ελληνικού στρατού. Εκείνο το τάγμα το χρηματοδοτούσε ο ίδιος ο Βύρον και οι κανιοβολητές του άρχισαν να εκπαιδεύονται εντατικά από τον Ιανουάριο. Μέχρι τα μέσα Μαρτίου, η επάνδρωση του τάγματος είχε ανέλθει σε 100 άνδρες που υπηρετούσαν 10 πυροβόλα. Από δε τις 22 Μαρτίου, ο Βύρον διόρισε γενικό αρχηγό στο πυροβολικό, τον Σουλιώτη Λάμπρο, που ήταν ο προσωπικός απεσταλμένος του Κολοκοτρώνη στον Βύρωνα. Εκεί όμως που διέπρεψε ο Λόρδος Βύρον ήταν ο ρόλος του στην αποκατάσταση της εθνικής ενότητας των Ελλήνων. Ο Βύρον θεωρούσε ότι η αραγής εθνική ενότητα αποτελεί όχι μόνο πολλαπλασιαστή ισχύως επί των πεδίων των μαχών και στις θάλασσες των ναυμαχιών, αλλά επιπλέον θεμελιώδη προϋπόθεση για την ανεξαρτησία της Ελλάδας. Όπως ο ίδιος έλεγε στο συναγωνιστή του φιλέλληνα Ιταλό Γκάμπα, «Δεν ήλθα εδώ για να ενταχθώ σε μια φατρία, αλλά σε μια εθνότητα και για να συνεργήσω με έντιμους ανθρώπους, όχι με κερδοσκόπους και καταχραστές, όπως οι Έλληνες αλληλοαποκαλούνται καθημερινά μεταξύ τους». Δήλωνε δε ο Βύρον εκατέρωθεν ότι η πρώτη του προτεραιότητα στην Ελλάδα ήταν η εθνική συμφιλίωση των Ελλήνων, όπως για παράδειγμα στην απαντητική του επιστολή προς το Χαράλαμπο Περούκα 22 Μαρτίου, στην οποία μεταξύ άλλων αναφέρει «Η πρωταρχική μου επιθυμία είναι ανέκαθεν να συμβάλλω, ώστε οι Έλληνες να συμφιλιωθούν μεταξύ τους». Θα ανοίξω στο σημείο αυτό μια παρένθεση Και θα υπενθυμίσω ότι το 1947 ο Πολ Πόρτερ, αντιπρόσωπος του Μάρσαλ και υπεύθυνος για την υλοποίηση του ομωνύμου σχεδίου στην Ελλάδα, στη διάρκεια του Μεγάλου Εμφυλίου Πολέμου, δυστυχώς ανέφερε σχεδόν τα ίδια. Θα πρέπει τα αντιτιθέμενα πολιτικά κόμματα της Ελλάδας, όσα ενδιαφέρονται για τη διατήρηση της ελληνικής ανεξαρτησίας, να εξομαλύνουν τις διαφορές τους και να εργαστούν για το κοινό συμφέρον της χώρας τους. Και σε άλλο σημείο, η έλλειψη εμπιστοσύνης μεταξύ των κυβερνητικών παραγόντων και του λαού στην ικανότητα της Ελλάδας να σώσει αυτήν οικονομικώς κλπ. Σε αυτό το πλαίσιο, ο Byron χρησιμοποίησε αποτελεσματικά την ιδιότητά του ως αρχιεπίτροπος του δανείου για να επιτύχει την καταλλαγή των εμφυλιακών παθών, απειλώντας τους μαχόμενους μεταξύ τους Έλληνες ότι δεν θα αποδέσμευε τις λίρες του θησαυρού από την Αγγλία παρά μόνο εάν σταματούσαν πλήρως τις ένοπλες εξουσιαστικές διαμάχες μεταξύ τους και επανέφεραν τα όπλα κατά των Τούρκων και μόνο. Και ρωτώ στο σημείο αυτό, είναι ή δεν είναι θλιβερό αυτό? Ενδεικτικά, σε εθνοενωτική επιστολή του, την οποία απέστειλε προς την κυβέρνηση νομοτελεστικό του Κουντουριώτη και στη Βουλή βουλευτικό υπό τον Κολοκοτρώνη, ο Byron προειδοποιεί και τις δύο αντιμαχόμενες παρατάξεις. Εάν δεν αποκατασταθεί η ομόνοια και η τάξη, τότε θα αποβούν μάταιες όλες οι ελπίδες μας για ένα δάνειο και επίσης όλη η βοήθεια που οι Έλληνες θα μπορούσαν να προσδοκούν από το εξωτερικό. Μια βοήθεια που δεν είναι ευτελής ούτε άνευ αξίας. Θα ανασταλεί ή και θα ματαιωθεί. Ως αποτέλεσμα, στις 17 Απριλίου, 2 μέρες πριν από τον πρόωρο θάνατο του Βύρωνα, οι επαναστατικές δυνάμεις των οπλαρχηγών του Βουλευτικού στην Τριπολιτσά, με 2.000 άντρες υπό τον Θεόδωρο Κολοκοτρώνη και τους με αυτόν οπλαρχηγούς γενναίες, ιστορικές και αξιόλογες προσωπικότητες, γενναίος Κολοκοτρώνης, Θεόδωρος Γρίβας, Νικήτας Σταματελόπουλος, ο γνωστός Νικηταράς ο Τουρκοφάγος, Κανέλος Δελιγιάννης, Παπατσόνης, Μήτρος Πέτροβας, Δημήτριος Πλαπούτας, παρέδωσαν την πόλη στα κυβερνητικά στρατεύματα του νομοτελεστικού με 3.000 άνδρες υπό τους οπλαρχηγούς Ανδρέα Λόντο, Γιατράκο, Νοταρά και Κεφάλα. Οι επαναστάτες, οι υπονομαζόμενοι τότε αντάρτες, απήλθαν ελεύθεροι με τον οπλισμό τους. Στη δε προηγηθήσα μάχη μεταξύ ανταρτών και κυβερνητικών στην Τριπολιτσά 13 Απριλίου, οι απώλειες των εμφυλιακών εμπλακέντων ήταν μόνο ένας νεκρός, λόγω της αυτοσυγκράτησης που επέδειξαν και οι δύο πλευρές. Όσο δηλαδή ζούσε ο Byron, συνετέλεσε καθοριστικά στην καταλλαγή των εμφυλιακών παθών στο πρώτο εξάμηνο του 24, με αποτέλεσμα η εμφύλια διαμάχη να αποκλιμακωθεί και να εκφυλιστεί σε πολιτική σκιαμαχία μεταξύ ένοπλων αγωνιστών, εν ώψη βέβαια της επικείμενης άφηξης στην Ελλάδα των λυρών. Είναι χαρακτηριστικό ότι ο Θόδωρος Κολοκοτρώνης παρέδωσε αυτοβούλος στην Τριπολιτσά στο κυβερνητικό στράτευμα υπό τον Ανδρέα Λόντο, ο οποίος ενεργούσε ως πολιτικός εκπρόσωπος του Λόρδου Βύρωνα στο Μοριά εκείνη την περίοδο. Κατά χρονική δε σύμπτωση, η εν πολλοίς ειρηνική παράδοση της Τριπολιτσάς από τον Κολοκοτρώνη στο Λόντο έγινε την ίδια μέρα, 17 Απριλίου, κατά την οποία, όπως ανέφερα, φτάνει στο Ιόνιο η αγγλική κορβέτα με την πρώτη δόση των 40.000 λιρών. Ενδεικτικά, των περίτεκτων χειρισμών του Βύρωνα για την εθνική συμφιλίωση των μαχόμενων μεταξύ τους Ελλήνων είναι τα δύο γεγονότα που θα αναφέρω. Παρότι ο Byron κράτησε σε διακριτική απόσταση τον Κολοκοτρώνη προκειμένου να μην προκαλέσει την εντύπωση ότι μεροληπτούσε υπέρ μιας από τις δύο παρατάξεις, ανέδειξε τον Σουλιώτη Λάμπρο, εκπρόσωπο του Κολοκοτρώνη, ως αρχηγό πυροβολικού, προκειμένου να στείλει ένα μήνυμα ενότητας. Εκτός από τον Κολοκοτρώνη, άλλοι μορέδες οπλαρχηγοί ζήτησαν τον Βύρωνα ή αντιπρόσωπό του να κατέβει στο Μοριά για να διαμεσολαβήσει. Ο Byron φαινομενικά δεν ανταποκρίθηκε, αλλά ουσιαστικά είχε ήδη υλοποιήσει την πρότασή τους, αφανώς μέσω του Λόντου, που ήταν φίλος του και από το 1823 de facto εκπρόσωπός του στο Μοριά. Δεν ήταν επομένως τυχαίο ότι η υποτονική πρώτη εμφύλια διαμάχη στο Μοριά έπαυσε στο πρώτο εξάμηνο του 24, με διαμεσολάβηση Λόντου Ζαΐμι, όπως επισημαίνει ο Σπυρίδων Τρικούπης. Ο Λόρδος Byron αναζωογόνησε το επιθετικό μαχητικό πνεύμα και το στρατηγικό σχέδιο των Περεβού Μπότσαρη για εκστρατεία των Ελλήνων προς βορρά, προς απελευθέρωση της Ελλάδας μέχρι τα στενά των Τεμπών και πριν αποβιώσει, πρόλαβε να το μεταλαμπαδεύσει στις ελληνικές στρατιωτικές δυνάμεις στη Ρούμελη. Από την 1η Ιουλίου, οι οπλαρχηγοί της Δυτικής Ρούμελης διεξήγαγαν μια τρίμηνη εκστρατεία με σκοπό να προωθήσουν το πολεμικό του σχέδιο προς βορρά, πέρα από τα βόρεια σύνορα της Ρούμελης, πίσω από τις νοητές γραμμές μετώπου του εχθρού στην Ήπειρο. Ας θυμηθούμε που ήταν τα σύνορά μας. Ειδικότερα, το κύριο βάρος της ελληνικής πολεμικής προσπάθειας θα έπεφτε στην Άρτα όπως και το 22, την οποία οι Έλληνες επεδίωκαν να απελευθερώσουν, αφού προηγουμένως δημιουργούσαν δύο βόρεια πολεμικά μέτωπα αντιπερισπασμού στο Ροδοβίτσι βορειοδυτικά της Άρτας και στα Τζουμέρκα βορειοανατολικά. Προς τούτο, οι Έλληνες συγκρότησαν μια επίλεκτη δύναμη 1.000 ανδρών υπό τους οπλαρχηγούς Ράγκο και Τσάγκο, με αποστολή τη διείσδυση στην Ήπειρο προς πολεμική διέγερση και καθοδήγηση των χριστιανικών πληθυσμών. Αν και έγιναν αρκετές προσπάθειες, το ελληνικό εκστρατευτικό σώμα επέστρεψε άπραγο το Σεπτέμβριο, χωρίς να επιτύχει την αποστολή του, γιατί υπήρχε απροθυμία των ορεσίβιων χωρικών εκείνων των ακριτικών περιοχών να έλθουν σε αντιπαράθεση με τους Τούρκους. Εν τούτοις, εκείνη η εν πολλής καταδρομική επιχείρηση στην Ήπειρο είχε ένα θετικό αποτέλεσμα υπέρ των Ελλήνων. Σύμφωνα με το πολεμικό σχέδιο του Δερβή Πασά, όταν η κύρια δύναμή του θα εξαστράτευε προς τα Σάλωνα, τότε θα επετίθεται ταυτόχρονα ένα τμήμα με τον Ομέρ Βριώνη στην Οτελοκαρνανία και με τον Ομέρ Πασά στην Αττική. Ο Βριώνης άρχισε την εκστρατεία του με μεγάλη καθυστέρηση. Αποβιβάστηκε στον Καρβασαρά, σημερινή Αμφιλοχία, επικεφάλης 5.000 Τουρκαλβανών, 1 Αυγούστου, δηλαδή 1 εβδομάδα μετά από την ήττα του κύριου τουρκικού στρατεύματος στη μάχη της Άμπλιανης, της Φωκίδας από τους Έλληνες 26 Ιουλίου. Ο Βριώνης δεν εκτέλεσε τις διαταγές του Δερβής Πασά, διότι την πρωτοβουλία των κινήσεων σε τακτικό επίπεδο την είχαν οι Έλληνες, με εκείνη την καταδρομική εκστρατεία που αναφέραμε στην Ήπειρο. Ειδικότερα, τα γεωγραφικώς διεσπαρμένα και δυναμικώς μετασχηματιζόμενα πολεμικά μέτωπα στη Δυτική Ελλάδα αύξησαν τους κινδύνους για το στράτευμα του Βριώνη. Επέτειναν τις εύλογες ανασφάλειές του, καθόν χρόνο μάλιστα έβλεπε το τουρκικό μέτωπο στην κεντρική Ρούμελη να καταρρέει. Παρόξυναν τις συμφιλιακές τάσεις μεταξύ Τουρκαλβανών, επίσης τα μετώπισαν του Βριώνη και τελικά κατέστησαν απρόθυμους και τους Τουρκαλβανούς αλλά και τον ίδιο τον Βριώνη να εκστρατεύσουν κατά των Ελλήνων. Σοφρόνος ο Βριώνης θεώρησε ότι ο πολεμικός αγώνας κατά των Ελλήνων εκείνη την περίοδο ήταν καταδικασμένος να αποτύχει όπως είχαν αποτύχει οι ενέργειες στην Ετωλακαρνανία μεταξύ 1821 και 23. Τελικά έφτασε ο χειμώνας και 18 Νοεμβρίου το στρατόπεδο του Βριώνη αυτοδιαλύθηκε. Οι Τουρκαλβανοί επέστρεψαν στην πατρίδα τους, πορευόμενοι από τον Καρβασαρά, είπαμε Αμφιλοχία, μέσω του Μακρινόρους, χωρίς οι ντόπιοι Έλληνες να τους αντιμάχονται, ή ως αν να υπήρχε σύμπνοια μεταξύ Ελλήνων και Τουρκαλβανών. Ή οι πρώτοι, οι Έλληνες δηλαδή, να έλεγαν στους δεύτερους: δεν μας πειράξατε, δεν σας πειράζουμε, κατεβόδιο και στον Αγύριστο. Έτσι, η στερεά εκενώθηκε πλήρως και από τα τελευταία τουρκαλβανικά στρατεύματα 19 Νοεμβρίου. 4 μέρες περίπου αφότου ολοκληρώθηκαν και οι επιχειρήσεις που αναφέραμε στο Αιγαίο. Συγκεφαλαιωτικά, λόγω της στρατηγικής ορμής και της χρηματοδοτικής ευραστίας, τις οποίες προσέδωσε στους Έλληνες ο Byron κατά το πρώτο εξάμηνο του 24, οι Έλληνες κυριάρχησαν πλήρως και κατά ξηρά και κατά θάλασσα στο δεύτερο εξάμηνο. Εκείνη η ιδέα κατά κυριάρχηση των Ελλήνων το 24 σηματοδότησε την οριστική ήττα των αυτοκρατορικών στρατευμάτων της υψηλής πύλης στην Ελλάδα. Κατά συνέπεια, ο Σουλτάνος εξαναγκάστηκε να εναποθέσει τις όποιες εναπομένουσες ελπίδες του για καταστολή της ελληνικής επανάστασης στα Αιγυπτιακά στρατεύματα του Ιμπραήμ Πασά το επόμενο έτος 25, παροξύνοντας όμως έτσι τα γεωστρατηγικά αντανακλαστικά των μεγάλων δυνάμεων και ειδικά της Μεγάλης Βρετανίας. Να αναφέρω τελειώντας το σημείο αυτό ότι η κατήσχηση των εμπόλιων Ελλήνων κατά ξηρά και θάλασσα το 24 συνετέλεσε καταληκτικά ως αναγκαία συνθήκη στη σύναψη του δευτέρου δανείου τον επόμενο έτος Φεβρουάριο του 25. Και ανεξάρτητα από τα αρνητικά σχόλια που ανέφερα για τα δάνεια, με το δάνειο αυτό το ελληνικό ναυτικό εξοπλίστηκε μεταξύ άλλων με το πολεμικό πλοίο Καρτερία, το ιστορικά πρώτο στον κόσμο ατμόπλοιο που έλαβε μέρος σε πολεμικές επιχειρήσεις. Μετά από 3 χρόνια, η Καρτερία καταναυμάχησε τουρκική μοίρα στην αυμαχία της Ιταίας, στον κόλπο της Αγκάλης στον Κορινθιακό, όπου 2 ελληνικές πολεμικές μοίρες στις 30 Σεπτεμβρίου με συνολικά 6 πλοία, με επικεφαλής την καρτερία υπό τον φιλέλληνα πλοίαρχο γνωστό σε όλους μας Άστιγκα και το πλοίο Σωτήρ υπό τον πλοίαρχο Θωμά, καταβήθησαν 7 από τα 9 τουρκικά πλοία που λιμενόζονταν εκεί. Η συντριπτική νίκη των Ελλήνων στην ναυμαχία της Ικτέας προκάλεσε στη συνέχεια, μετά από μόλις 3 εβδομάδες, την Ευρωοθωμανική ναυμαχία του Ναβαρίνου, 20 Οκτωβρίου του 1927, στην οποία ο Οθωμανικός και Αιγυπτιακός στόλος ιτούνται από τις Βρετανικές υπό τον ναύαρχο Κόδρικτον, Γαλλικές ναύαρχο Δεριγνή και Ρωσικές ναύαρχο Χέιδεν δυνάμεις. Μια ναυμαχία καταλυτική, όπως όλοι γνωρίζουμε, για την εξέλιξη του αγώνα της Παλιγενεσίας. Κυρίες και κύριοι, όσα ανέφερα, αποτελούν μια μικρή μόνο περιγραφή των όσων χρωστάμε στο Λόρδο Βύρωνα. Δεν θα σας κουράσω άλλο. Θεωρώ ιδιαίτερη τιμή για μένα προσωπικά το γεγονός ότι βρέθηκα σήμερα εδώ, σε αυτόν τον ιερό και ιστορικό χώρο της Δημοκρατίας, σε αυτή την εκδήλωση για την προσωπικότητα που λέγεται Λόρδος Βύρων και εκφώνησα μια ομιλία για τη μεγάλη προσφορά του στα στρατιωτικά επιτεύγματα της χώρας μας. Επιτεύγματα που βοήθησαν στην απελευθέρωση της μικρής τότε Ελλάδας, της Ελλάδας που μετά από 200 χρόνια και πολλούς εχθρούς και αγώνες είναι πια μεγάλη και παλεύει να παραμείνει μεγάλη. Και θα παραμείνει μεγάλη γιατί, παραφράζοντας τους στίχους του Κωστή Παλαμά, χρωστάμε σε όσους ήρθαν, πέρασαν, θα έρθουνε, θα περάσουν, κριτές θα μας δικάσουν, οι αγέννητοι, οι νεκροί. Σας ευχαριστώ για την υπομονή σας. Ζητώ την κατανόησή σας, διότι πρέπει να αποχωρήσω τώρα για να σπεύσω να συνδράμω ένα στενό συγγενή μου που αντιμετωπίζει σοβαρό πρόβλημα υγείας. Τη θέση μου στο πάνελ θα την λάβει ο επιστημονικός μου συνεργάτης, Τζον Πάπας, που είναι διακεκριμένο μέλος της Κιβωτού Ολιστικής Παιδείας Ενόπλων Δυνάμεων και PhD Fellow του Πανεπιστημίου Κολούμπια των ΗΠΑ. Επιπλέον, είναι ιστορικός συγγραφέας με περισσότερα από 330 βιβλία και άρθρα για την Επανάσταση του 1821. Και θα απαντήσει σε τυχόν επιμέρους ερωτήσεις σας σχετικά με τη συμβολή του Λόρδου Βύρωνα στις στρατιωτικές επιχειρήσεις κατά ξηρά και θάλασσα στον αγώνα της Παλιγενεσίας. Και πάλι σας ευχαριστώ.
Στρατηγέ, σας ευχαριστούμε πολύ. Πραγματικά μαθαίνουμε σήμερα εδώ σημαντικές πτυχές της πολυδιάστατης προσωπικότητας του Βύρωνα και του εμβληματικού του έργου για την απελευθέρωση της Ελλάδας. At this point, let me inform you that Professor George Holmes will need to join a University Council board meeting that will take place online, but he should be back with us in about 20 minutes or so. We will continue now with a brief introduction to Lord Byron's humanitarian involvement in the Greek Revolution, provided by the Associate Dean and the Head of Psychology Department at New York College, Dr. Antonias Svensson. Dr. Svensson, the floor is yours. Η ομιλία της κυρίας Svensson θα πραγματοποιηθεί στα αγγλικά, ωστόσο τυπωμένη μετάφραση στα ελληνικά υπάρχει διαθέσιμη στα έδρανα.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Kalispera. In my brief presentation today, I aim to shed light on some primary sources of historical significance, particularly some letters penned by Lord Byron himself. Through these letters, we can glimpse into Byron's philanthropic empathy and profound humanitarianism. The letters are taken from the Count Pietro Gamba's book entitled Last Journey to Greece. One notable instance showcasing Byron's compassion occurred on January 23rd, 1824, 2 weeks after his arrival in Messaloniki. Byron appealed to the Greek authorities for the release of 4 Turkish prisoners of war, held captive as hostages since 1822. To this end, he addressed Alexandros Mavrokordatos, the governor of Messaloniki, pleading for their immediate and unconditional release. Remarkably, the Greek authorities swiftly heeded Byron's plea, granting his request without delay. Byron, true to his word, ensured the safe passages of the hostages to Patras, a city under Turkish occupation at the time, to their unconditional freedom. In a letter addressed to Yusuf Pasha of Patras, Byron expressed his earnest desire for humane treatment and release of all Greek hostages, or prisoners of war. He wrote, "Highness, in the hope that it may not be altogether displeasing to your Highness, I have requested the governor of this place to release 4 Turkish prisoners, and he has humanely consented to do so. These prisoners are liberated without any conditions, but should the circumstance find a place in your recollection, I venture to beg that your Highness will treat such Greeks as henceforth fall into your hands with humanity, more especially since the horrors of war are sufficiently great in themselves without being aggravated by wanton cruelties on either side." Signed by Lord Byron himself. Continuing on our exploration of Lord Byron's humanitarian endeavours, I'd like to draw your attention to another poignant episode in his life, occurring just 2 weeks after his previous act of compassion. On February 4th, 1824, Byron once again demonstrated his deep empathy by advocating for the release of all 24 Turkish prisoners, including women and children, who had been held hostage in Mesolongi since the eruption of the Greek Revolution in 1821. In response to Byron's plea, the Mesolongites consented immediately to release the Turkish prisoners unconditionally. Immediately thereafter, without hesitation, Byron ensured their safe passage to the British consulate in Preveza, a town that was under Turkish occupation at the time. From there, the released Turks were granted freedom to proceed to their chosen destinations. In a relevant letter addressed to the British consul in Preveza, William Mayer, Byron conveyed his commitment to upholding the principles of humanity and compassion, even in wartime. He wrote, "Sir, coming to Greece, one of my principal objects was to alleviate as much as possible the miseries incident to a warfare so cruel as the present. When the dictates of humanity are in question, I know no difference between Turks and Greeks. It is enough that those who want assistance are men, in order to claim the pity and the protection of the meanest pretender to humane feelings. I have found here 24 Turks, including women and children who have long pined in distress, far from the means of support and consolations of their home. The government has consigned them to me. I transmit them to Preveza, whither they desire to be sent. I hope you will not object to take care that they may be restored to a place of safety, and that the governor of your town may accept of my present. The best recompense I can hope for would be to find that I had inspired the Ottoman commanders with the same sentiments towards those unhappy Greeks who may hereafter fall into their hands." Signed by Lord Byron himself. These letters not only illuminate Byron's remarkable compassion, but they also place him at the forefront of humanitarian history. It's noteworthy that almost 4 decades before the establishment of the International Committee of the Red Cross in 1863, and nearly 90 years before the founding of the International Prisoners of War Agency in 1914, Byron was already pioneering humanitarian initiatives concerning prisoners of war. Byron's initiatives in Mesolongi embody a universal ethos of humanitarianism that transcends borders and ideologies. His choice to unilaterally and unconditionally release prisoners of war, while not demanding reciprocation from the opposing side, established a precedent for basic humanitarian norms between warring factions. Moreover, Byron's philanthropic endeavours extended beyond mere gestures of liberation. One poignant example is his involvement with a Turkish young girl aged 8 or 9 who had been held captive in Mesolongi for 3 years alongside her mother. Her father had managed to escape, and to take refuge in the court of Yusuf Pasha in Patras. Despite their dire circumstances, Byron ensured their freedom and their well-being, personally arranging for their relocation to Kefalonia under the care of Dr. Kennedy, an English doctor on the island. Byron's intention wasn't just immediate relief, but also long-term support, offering to cover the child's education expenses in Italy or in England. Pietro Gamba, Byron's trusted companion during his time in Greece, underscores the practical significance of Byron's humanistic actions, emphasizing their alignment with fundamental humanitarian principles. He writes, "The object of these measures was apparent. He, Byron, had hopes that such conduct might tend to soften the ferocity which had occasionally distinguished the treatment of the Turkish prisoners, and to induce both Turks and Greeks to regulate themselves by the usages of civilized warfare, rather than according to the sanguinary retaliation which marks the struggle between a master and a slave." As we delve deeper into the extraordinary acts of humanity displayed by Lord Byron, we encounter a profoundly poignant moment that serves as a testament to his unwavering commitment to the principles of compassion and empathy. On April 15th, 1824, just 4 days before his untimely passing, Byron received a letter from Yusuf Pasha of Patras. In this letter, Pasha expressed his gratitude to Byron for the release of the Turkish captives. Furthermore, Pasha, acknowledging Byron's noble deeds, encouraged him to continue his humanitarian efforts amidst the ongoing conflict, even hinting at a potential reciprocal Turkish gesture towards Greek prisoners of war. This letter brought great joy to Byron's dying heart. Despite being gravely ill and on the brink of death, Byron, on 16th of April, 1824, exactly 200 years ago today, summoned the last reserves of his strength to compose a reply to Yusuf Pasha. Byron entrusted the letter to Gamba to translate it into Greek for the benefit of both the Turkish and Greek people. That was Byron's final letter, which stands as a testament to his enduring legacy of compassion and goodwill. Count Peter Gamba is the author of the journal from which the excerpts of text I'm reading are published. Even in his final moments, Byron's thoughts were consumed by concern for others and reflections on the world around him. His last words resonate with deep empathy and a sense of regret for not having acted sooner to alleviate the suffering he witnessed. His heartfelt sentiments extend to Greece, the town of Missolonghi, his devoted servants, his daughter in England, and the world. He writes, "Poor Greece, poor town, my poor servants, why was I not aware of this sooner? My hour is come. I do not care for death, but why would I not go home before I came here? There are things which make the world dear to me. For the rest, I am content to die." In summary, Byron's humanitarian initiatives during wartime epitomize his unwavering commitment to mitigating the human toll of the Greek-Turkish conflict. He advocated a de-escalation of that war to a conventional, tactical level. In other words, he tried to contain the hostilities between troops only, in order to minimize civilian casualties and ensure humane treatment of prisoners of war. Byron's paradigm of unilaterally and unconditionally releasing prisoners of war reflects his commitment to fostering humanistic empathy amidst the chaos of war, serving as an enduring beacon of hope for humanity. In this context, Byron contributed significantly to Greece economically, militarily, and diplomatically. But Greece also provided him with a platform to champion humanism in the post-Napoleonic era. His initiatives in Greece, though ahead of his time, foreshadowed the principles later enshrined in the Geneva Accords, highlighting the enduring relevance in advancing humanitarianism in wartime. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Svensson, for the informative approach to another important aspect of Byron's humanistic deeds in the Greek War of Independence. And now, ladies and gentlemen, it is a great pleasure to introduce tonight's keynote speaker, Dr. Corinne Throsby. Corinne Throsby grew up in Australia and attended the Australian National University, which is where she first came across Byron's poetry and decided to write her undergraduate thesis on him. She was awarded the University Medal in English Literature and won a scholarship to attend the University of Oxford. There, she received her master's and PhD, focusing her dissertation again on Lord Byron. She now teaches cultural history, English literature, and essay writing at Byron's alma mater, the University of Cambridge, and appears regularly on BBC Radio as one of their new generation thinkers. She also reviews for the Times Literary Supplement, and her article on the two latest Byron biographies is on the cover of the current issue. She is currently writing her first novel, which features Byron as a principal character. Today, Dr. Throsby will be talking about how Byron came to be the first literary celebrity in modern world history. Dr. Throsby, please join us for the keynote speech.
I'd like to begin by saying a very sincere thank you to the panel, to the sponsors of this event, and to my new friends at New York College. I'm so grateful for you and honored to be here. It really is special to be in the place that Byron breathed his last breath in Greece 200 years to mark this incredible bicentenary. So thank you very much. I've flown all the way from Australia, and I wasn't sure at one point if I was going to make it here, because I was in Doha airport when they were announcing that Middle Eastern airspace was closing. So it feels like a kind of Byronic miracle that I actually made it here. And after this event, I'm going on to Cambridge, where I teach, where Byron's alma mater, Trinity College, putting on an event to commemorate this same bicentenary, and I'll be speaking at the conference there. And it's a lot of commemoration happening this week, quite rightly, but today in Athens, we're really celebrating rather than commemorating exactly. We're thinking about this amazing life, and I was thinking about the title of this event, Unparalleled Phenomenon. These are big words, but I think if they can be applied to anyone, it's Lord Byron. And one of the ways in which Byron was truly groundbreaking, and yes, I think we can use the word unparalleled, was in his role as Britain's first literary celebrity. Now, celebrity is such an integral part of contemporary culture. It's difficult to think of a world before gossip sites and Instagram and influencers, but its origins go all the way back to Byron. There have been a lot of famous people before Byron, but he was one of the first public figures who was so popular that his name itself became a commodity. He was a product put up for public consumption by a newly established press. His success was shown in his unprecedented poetry sales. His poem, The Corsair, sold 10,000 copies in one day when it was released in 1814, producing an unheard of 7 editions in the first 2 months of publication. It wasn't just his poetry that sold well. It spawned an entire industry of fakes, forgeries, and pirated editions, anything to make money off the Byron name. You could also buy Byron souvenirs, neckties and prints and teaspoons with his image. Stories of his love life appeared in every gossip column. And it was Byron's celebrity that was one of his big contributions to the Greek War of Independence. His fame brought international attention and sympathy to the Greek cause. Today I ask, how did one man, born in relatively humble circumstances, become such a phenomenon? The answer is not simple. There were many factors that, when they came together, exploded in a kind of perfect storm. In this talk, I will pick apart these threads to illuminate the origins of celebrity culture through Byron. First, I'm going to talk about how Byron's exceptional personal qualities and life contributed to his fame. Then I'll look at what was happening in the culture and publishing industry to enable his phenomenal sales figures. Then I'll focus on Byron's poetry itself and how he was able to make people feel personally connected to him. In the last half of my talk, I'm going to look in depth at how readers responded to Byron's poetry and fame. Byron created poems that deliberately and ingeniously provoked a response from his fans. He was the first person in Britain to receive fan mail on a mass scale, and I'm going to share these remarkable letters with you. I think the letters demonstrate the enormous power of Byron's work and persona and give us invaluable insight into the way he was read in his time. I'll then finish by talking briefly about Byron's involvement in the Greek War and how this related to his celebrity, though I should say that I'm not an expert on the war, and it's been wonderful to learn more about it during this trip and hopefully more tonight. When academics first started thinking about celebrity culture, they placed an emphasis on the celebrity's seemingly magical personal qualities as the primary catalyst for fame. And early assessments of Byron's work have emphasized his kind of personal glamour as the primary reason for his success. Richard Dyer, the author of one of the first academic studies of fame in the Hollywood system, argues that an individual needs to transcend class, race, sexuality, and gender in order to achieve stardom. And Byron certainly had extremely wide appeal. He was an aristocrat and yet was a champion of the working class. He was politically radical, but for most of his career had a conservative publisher. His sexuality was ambiguous. He was outwardly masculine, yet emotionally vulnerable in a way that appealed to both men and women. Plus, if you're even slightly familiar with Byron's life story, you'll know that it couldn't have helped but create intrigue and interest. Now, lots of you might know about Byron's life, but for those of you who don't, let me give you a quick rundown of his fascinating and very complex life. This is just in brief. He had relatively humble beginnings. He was born in 1788 in London. His father, who was a bit of a scoundrel, ran off when Byron was a baby and died when Byron was 3. So Byron was raised by a single mother with not much money in his mother's hometown of Aberdeen in relatively remote Scotland. He was born with a deformed foot and walked with a limp and was bullied at school. At the age of 10, everything changed. An unknown cousin died and Byron inherited the title of Lord and a huge family seat in Nottingham, England. He then attended the hugely prestigious Harrow School, which is where he first learnt about and fell in love with ancient Greece, and his classical education continued in Cambridge, though it's actually amazing that he learned anything at university, because in those days, aristocrats didn't actually need to attend any classes to graduate. He also got up to lots of mischief in Cambridge, famously bringing a bear with him to college when he was told he couldn't bring his beloved pet dog. He made some lifelong friends during this period, including John Cam Hobhouse, and it was with Hobhouse that he embarked on a grand tour of the continent, like many British gentlemen of the day. But while most others went to France and Italy, the Napoleonic Wars pushed Byron and Hobhouse east to Greece and Albania, which cemented Byron's deep love for all things Hellenic. When he returned to England, he gave his first speech in the House of Lords, defending the workers in his hometown of Nottingham who were being put to death for protesting against their conditions. So, from a relatively early age, he was interested in defending underdog causes. He'd been writing poetry this whole time, but based on his trip to Europe, he published a poem called Childe Harold's Pilgrimage, the second canto of which was set in Greece.
The poem was a huge hit, and Byron joked that after it came out, he awoke to find himself famous. He then wrote a string of more hit poems and was involved in some extreme scandals in London, including affairs with the wife of the soon-to-be Prime Minister and his half-sister. He married briefly as a gesture towards respectability, but the marriage was a short-lived disaster. And engulfed in scandal, Byron decided to leave England. He went to Switzerland, where he spent his famous stormy night with the poet Percy Bysshe Shelley and writer Mary Shelley. Here, Byron suggested that they each tell ghost stories, which resulted in Mary Shelley writing her brilliant novel Frankenstein. Byron told a story he'd heard in Greece about vampires, which his doctor John Polidori turned into a novel and based the vampire character on Lord Byron himself. And this directly inspired Bram Stoker's Dracula, so it was a big night in literary history. Byron later moved to Italy, notably Venice, where he lived a life of excess and debauchery and kept a menagerie of animals, all while writing some of his greatest poems. He finally settled down in Ravenna with his longest ever partner, Teresa Guiccioli. And I wouldn't say he got bored exactly, but through political conviction, a love of Greece, and a desire to do something more meaningful with his life, he decided to join the Greek War of Independence. Poetically, one of the greatest playboys that history has known died a freedom fighter. So of course, you can't live that sort of life and not attract attention to yourself. But there have been plenty of larger-than-life, scandalous writers who didn't achieve Byron's celebrity. So why was he the first? The answer, in many ways, is down to timing. Byron's career happened to coincide with huge advances in publishing and literacy. In the early 18th century, most books were hand-printed and distributed through a system of private subscription. It was only the upper class who could read, and it was mostly men. There were so few literate people that they may well have known the author of a book they were reading personally. By the late 18th century, with the advent of the large-scale printing press, books started to be produced mechanically, en masse. People wrote a lot at the time about how they felt overwhelmed by the amount of printed material available. It's so funny reading this because much of the rhetoric is very much the same as the type of rhetoric we have now involving the internet, that there's too much material, it's bad quality, and everyone is losing their ability to read critically. There was also a huge increase in literacy. During the early 19th century, more and more working people and women began to learn to read. So Byron's career happened to coincide with this new, massive audience of people hungry for exciting reading material and the technological ability to print on this huge scale. Now, I'm aware that at 7:30, the General sadly has to leave us, so he's going to exit quietly at some point soon. During this period, romantic ideas of authorial genius was starting to take hold, and a small number of writers were elevated above the crowd by the newly emerging media. The Times newspaper was established just 3 years before Byron was born. It was at this time that words like celebrity, star, and glamour came into popular use. This specific vocabulary emerged to describe a new kind of public life in which certain individuals were held up as objects of adoration, ridicule, and gossip. But there were plenty of extraordinary writers, roughly the same age as Byron, and many of their poetry has really stood the test of time. Wordsworth, Coleridge, Keats, Shelley, none of whom were as popular as Byron when they were alive. So why Byron? I think that his phenomenal success was due to something specific that he was doing in his poetry. Byron had an ability to create the illusion that even though he was writing for this mass audience, he was speaking directly to individual readers. At first, this happened almost by accident. Initially, Byron had aimed much of his poetry at his friends and family, and in doing so, he created an intimate style filled with coded personal references and in-jokes. This illusion of an inner circle of readers was one that he sustained even after his poetry was being read by tens of thousands. His writing often contains references to the fact that only careful readers will truly understand the poems. One of the most popular of his poems, published at the back of Childe Harold's Pilgrimage, reads, "Ours too the glance none saw beside, the smile none else might understand, the whispered thought of hearts allied, the pressure of the thrilling hand." Glances, whispers, brief touches. Not only is this passage teasingly erotic, but also highly intimate. This is a dialogue that none else might understand. Even though this poem was being read, copied out, and memorized by countless readers, women in particular, each could believe it was a message just for them. A critic in the Edinburgh Review wrote of Byron's poems, "They are not felt as declarations published to the world, but almost as secrets whispered to chosen ears." Byron also delighted his readers by placing small details about his personal life in his poems. He continually used the same character, the dark, brooding anti-hero with a tough exterior and hidden past, and readers started to assume that the author was writing about himself. Now, Byron often denied that his work was autobiographical, and yet he playfully included physical descriptions of his heroes as having his own dark curly hair and pale skin. In his poem The Giaour, for example, which was published immediately after Childe Harold's Pilgrimage made him famous, the hero was described with supremely Byronic features. "See, by the half-illumined wall, his hood fly back, his dark hair fall, that pale brow wildly wreathing round." The fact that the hero is only partially lit and cloaked in a hood makes this glimpse of the pale brow particularly alluring. Byron would have written these lines around the same time as he was sitting for Thomas Phillips' portrait of 1813, which cemented Byron's signature look, the dark curl, pale skin, pouty lips, and open collared shirt. The portrait was copied countless times, and most readers would have seen it in print shop windows or as a frontispiece in the many editions of Byron's books. So when Byron instructs the reader to see that pale brow of his character, he's implicitly conjuring an image of his own physical form. This is not a public gaze that he's inviting, but a private, intimate one. He makes a point of saying that it is only the close observer that can espy. That is Lord Byron when they look upon the Giaour. He tells the reader that they are separate from the common crowd who only see the gloom. These lines suggest that only a select few will ever truly understand the poet, and there is a possibility that any particular reader could be one of those few. In the 1970s, reader response theorists like Wolfgang Iser started to talk about how the reader is just as important as the author when it comes from creating a text meaning. And we know this, that when two people read the same poem, they can come up with two very, very different interpretations. The reader brings all their own ideas to a text, and when there are what Iser calls gaps, for example, a jump in time, the reader needs to fill in what happened in their own imagination. And I think Byron's poetry is particularly filled with these gaps that the reader has to navigate. If you look at the Giaour, we see a poem that is filled with blanks. I mean, literally, there are sort of entire lines of asterisks as if there's a piece of the poem missing. The poem is made up of numerous disjointed fragments told by different narrators with chronically inconsistent transitions. The first edition of the Giaour was published in February 1814 and had a relatively linear adventure-style plot. But by the 7th edition at the end of 1815, Byron had transformed it into his most fragmented, confusing work. Rather than the process of clarification that one might expect, Byron's revisions mystified his poem, chopping up the plotline, lending everything a shadowy, furtive quality. I think the playful word flirtation is a good way of describing what Byron is doing here. The German sociologist Georg Simmel wrote an essay on flirtation in which he describes it as a very active way of interacting because the flirt is always trying to provoke a response. The flirt teases their partner into desiring them by a process of semi-concealment, whereby the act of concealment actually draws attention to that which is tantalizingly unavailable and makes it more desirable because of this. The image of a woman adorned in a veil is for Simmel the embodiment of flirtatious semi-concealment. The alluring nature of the veil is a recurring trope throughout Byron's poetry. In his poem Marino Faliero, for example, Byron writes, "The veil which blackens o'er his blighted name and hides or seems to hide these lineaments shall draw more gazers than the 1,000 portraits which glitter round it in their pictured trappings." The active role the reader has to play in the creation of meaning as a result of Byron's semi-concealment was recognized from very early on. The poet Walter Scott, who was a friend of Byron's, wrote in a letter to him, "Every real lover of poetry is obliged to you for condensing the narrative by giving us only striking scenes and leaving to the imagination the says I's and says he's and all the minutiae of details which might be proper in giving us evidence before a court of justice. The truth is, I think poetry is most striking when the mirror can be held up to the reader." Later, Byron himself wrote about his deliberate attempt to activate readers' imaginations in his late masterpiece, Don Juan. He says, "But all descriptions garble the true effect, and so we had better not be too minute. An outline is the best. A lively reader's fancy does the rest." The term flirtation implies a two-way interaction, and I think it's unsurprising given the poet's provocative and open way that he wrote, that his readers felt prompted to respond to his poetry. Unable to contain the pleasure that they felt, or the connection they imagined themselves as having to the author of the poems they were reading, his readers continued the flirtatious dialogue initiated by the poet. And one way they did this was by writing to him directly. He was the first author in Britain to receive fan mail on a mass scale. Byron wrote to John Murray on 15th of July, 1817, which was relatively early in his career, saying, "I suppose in my life I've received at least 200 anonymous letters, 300, of love, literature, advice, abuse, menace or consolation, upon all topics and in every shape." Considering Byron's status as a celebrity author, this comes as no real surprise to us now. We now tend to think of fan mail as an inevitable byproduct of fame. Yet the fact that Byron's fans felt so moved by his poetry as to be compelled to write to him as if they knew him, at a time when this was considered highly unusual practice, is an extraordinary testament to the success of Byron's intimate poetic style. And I'm going to spend this last half of the talk looking at what these letters can tell us about Byron's work and celebrity. The fan letters women wrote to Byron offer a uniquely personal and individual insight into the way people read his poetry. They're as flirtatious and self-revealing as Byron's work. Some read like highly personal confessions, while others are like a studied public performance. These letters create an illusion of closeness and affinity, and yet they're written by one stranger to another. They blur the distinction between public and private writing in a way that we're now used to in social media, but was extremely unusual at the time. I thought I'd read one of these letters out in its entirety to give you an idea of what they're like. So while I'm doing this, I want you to imagine if you've ever written fan mail yourself. See how much this is the same or differs from how you might write a fan letter today. My Lord, though I have not the honor of being personally known to you, I yet venture to address you. I cannot offer any other excuse for the liberty I take. My Lord, I have been indebted to your muse for soothing and interesting some of my saddest hours. I have wept over Childe Harold's griefs and sympathized in his wrongs. Often have I wandered in the garden with your poem for my companion, and with thee conversing have forgot all time. I have hung in rapt attention over every line of Childe Harold. I am not a critic, but an inexperienced young woman, but the language of genius and of nature must be felt right to my heart. Who can read those lines without feeling the tenderest compassion for their unhappy author? I have often remarked with pleasure traits of tenderness and warm affection bursting through the gloom which too generally pervades your poem. I do most deeply enter into your feelings, perhaps so because I have felt the same cause in some respects to despair. My Lord, I have known what it is to lose those we love. And here she inserts a long poem that she's written, which I will spare you from the details. I mean, it's not bad, but it's a very long poem about her life. Then she says, these lines are part of some composed at a time when I so much wanted consolation, yet I experienced the most cruel indifference to my griefs from one who I had the right to expect should have wiped away my tears. Lord Byron, I entreat you not to leave your native country and waste your precious days in solitude. And though I may be thought enthusiastic, still I feel gratified that I have done my part, all I could do. And though I have not the vain presumption to think that what I can say has any weight with you, my Lord, still I was never easy till I performed this task, till I poured forth my heart before you. I only entreat that you will not show this letter to anyone. Spare me and let it sink into oblivion. May God ever bless and protect you, Lord Byron. Anna. Around 90 of these letters have survived, and I've looked at them in the Murray Archive in the National Library of Scotland, and there are also some in the New York Public Library as well. The majority of the letters are unsigned, undated, and without an address. Of the letters in which it's possible to ascertain the gender of the writer, either through his or her name or the use of the personal pronoun, the vast majority are written by women. Only 3 of the letters are definitely written by men. The anonymity of the letters means that it's difficult to know the background and social class of the letter writers, although differences in paper quality, penmanship, and spelling ability indicate they're probably from a fairly broad cross-section of the reading community. While each letter is unique, it's possible to identify several common themes that unify them as a group. So the vast majority of the writers express feelings of alienation from the world, identification with Byron, and a projection of their own personal circumstances and fantasies onto Byron's work and public persona. What's striking about them is the creativity they demonstrate. Byron's poetry inspired readers to assume the role of writers. Many of the letters are written in verse or contain literary tributes to Byron and his poems. Although a large number of the writers apologize for the presumption of writing to someone they've never met, they continually emphasize that it's Byron's poetry itself that enables them to feel so connected to the author. Many of them address Byron by his characters' names, the Corsair and Childe Harold, as if he and his characters are interchangeable. As we've seen, Anna describes Byron's poetry almost in human terms as a companion who converses with her, like the poem itself is a friend. There's a distinctly erotic edge to the reader-author relationship in this passage. As the term conversing had sexual connotations at the time, criminal conversation was then, as it is now, a legal term for adultery. In many ways, the letters confirm the fears that were often expressed in the press at the time, that the sensual nature of Byron's poetry would corrupt Britain's fair countrywomen. One anonymous writer sent Byron a Valentine's Day poem in which she continually uses terms with distinctly sexual connotations. She sighs for Byron, drawing attention to her bosom swelling with wild tumults. Another fan writes with similar sexual metaphors, "Why did my breast with rapture grow, thy talents to admire? Why, as I read, my bosom felt enthusiastic fire." Clearly, for many of the women reading Byron's poetry was a powerfully erotic experience. Yet the sexual element of the letters is only one aspect of the women's investment in Byron. Although female fans still today are often assumed to be groupies who just want to sleep with the object of their affection, I think that fascination with the star is based on a fantasy that might not be so much to do with sexuality as with power. While imagining their relationship with a celebrity, fans are often interested in forging an active, creative role for themselves, rather than taking the passive role of sexual object. The letters suggest a deep engagement with Byron's poetry that belies the caricature of the Byromaniac. That was a term that Byron's wife coined for the hysteria surrounding Byron. And a lot of critics at the time described his fans as a mob. One says they're the thoughtless, dazzled throng. But in the fan letters, almost all the women mention the intellectual satisfaction they get from reading Byron's work, with one writer describing herself as deeply indebted for a constant source of intellectual pleasure. Several women, like Anna, draw attention to the fact that their femininity lies at odds with their ability to read critically. One woman apologizes for her shortcomings as a female reader, but also asserts in no uncertain terms that she has studied Byron with great attention. Her letter is long and provides some close analysis of a wide range of Byron's work. So at a time when women had relatively few outlets for literary expression, these letters performed a vital function. In the early 19th century, women were starting to gain confidence as cultural critics in a form traditionally dominated by men. These letters show women tentatively asserting a critical voice, using a reassuringly anonymous medium. And I think the anonymity of these letters is really interesting. The courtesan Harriet Wilson at the time talked about the freedom that she felt at a masquerade ball, because when you're wearing a mask, you can behave however you want. And it was clearly liberating for a lot of the women to write under the guise of anonymity. Mostly, if women do sign their letter, they either use what is presumably their own first name and just their first name, like Anna and Rosalie, or a playful descriptive such as a stranger or your unknown friend, or they use a figure from literature or classical mythology, like Valentina or Echo. The woman called Rosalie actually gives Byron an alias. She asks him to get in touch with her by placing an advertisement in the Sunday Observer using the codename Antonio, presumably a reference to the melancholic hero of The Merchant of Venice. The Byronic hero was ambiguous enough that he could play endless roles for his fans. The most often quoted section of his poetry in the letters is from the third canto of The Corsair. His heart was formed for softness, warped to wrong, betrayed too early, and beguiled too long. Byron's correspondence addressed the quotation to him, your heart, as if it were about the author rather than the fictional Conrad, with one woman adding, I cannot help believing the truth of the following lines as applied to yourself. Byron created a hero that is alienated from society, rebellious and emotionally complex, a mixture of an outwardly tough and impenetrable persona combined with a deeply sensitive interior. We still see this character type continuously in popular culture, from Heathcliff to Han Solo to Captain Jack Sparrow to countless teen vampires. The reason why the Byronic hero seems to appeal so heavily to readers is that his potential for wickedness, the fact that he's fallen, creates an opportunity for reform, a change that can be enabled by the reader herself. 2 in 3 of the letters in this Murray archive contain some kind of rumination on how bad and misanthropic Byron was, but that he is essentially formed for softness. There's no doubt an erotic charge to Byron's imagined role as the dangerous sinner who can be tamed by the right woman, because it puts the woman in an active and at times dominant role. The idea that the Byronic hero is wounded, dangerous, and sinful allows the reader to put themselves in the position of the healer, lover, and reformer. Several of the women see their role as trying to ease Byron's suffering and say that they hope the letter will make him feel less alone. For others, comforting Byron takes an almost Oedipal motherly role. One says, and wert thou child, a child of mine, I'd soothe thee with a mother's love. In these fantasies, the comforting of Byron is often linked to having some kind of inspirational effect on his work. Another says, I will cheer thee this life's darkest gloom, and brighter will thy genius shine. The fan letter expresses a fantasy of influencing Byron's narratives so that the hero's story moves from tragic to hopeful, and the reader herself becomes the initiator and creator of the potential happy ending. A common way in which women attempted to take an active role in shaping the Byronic hero is by positioning themselves as Byron's religious confessor. A huge number of letters come from women concerned about the poet's spiritual well-being and express an urgent desire to save him from damnation. None of the letters make any direct reference to Byron's real-life scandals or indiscretions, although they were well known at the time, but rather take Childe Harold's perceived sins as evidence for the poet's moral weakness. There's a sense in the letters that each fan sees herself as uniquely suited to help Byron, that no one understands his suffering as well as she. And again, we see this in contemporary fan culture as well, where people feel that in this sort of sea of fans, that they are the one true fan. The letter writers often illustrate their unique insight into Byron's character by providing sometimes quite detailed personal information about themselves in their letters. Many of the letters include stories about the writer's family situation, romantic relationships, and religious beliefs. This information is used to assert a connection with Byron's heroes, even if their situation seems quite different from anything Byron has written about. And again, thinking about those gaps that Byron put in his poetry, where people are able to sort of project themselves onto his poems. The main characteristic of Byron's persona with which the readers seem to identify is his feeling of alienation from the world, often referring to their own deeply wounded spirit. While the letter writers say they are trying to comfort Byron by writing to him, the letters also act as a vehicle for comforting themselves, and they read almost like diary entries rather than letters. Anna suggests that the process of writing the letter operates almost like personal therapy, as the writer provides a catharsis for her suffering. Yet unlike many diaries, these letters are directed towards a reader, Byron, and they often demonstrate an anxiety that he will be hostile to their work. Anna, for example, expresses the extreme mortification she'd feel at the thought of Byron ridiculing her letter. Rosalie dramatically asks Byron to burn her letter if it is unwelcome to him. Another correspondent requests Byron to destroy these lines as soon as you have thrown a glance. Yet as a kind of real-life fictional character, Childe Harold personified, Byron is clearly a relatively safe recipient of these very personal and revelatory confessions. If anything, Byron plays a strangely passive role in the letters, as a figure for the women to project themselves onto. One woman, who calls herself Echo, writes, "Should curiosity prompt you, and should you not be afraid of gratifying it, by trusting yourself alone in the Green Park at 7 o'clock this evening, you will see Echo. Be on that side of the Green Park that has the gate opening onto Piccadilly and leave the rest to Echo." Although Echo seems to be expressing a desire to meet Byron, there is still a strong element of fancifulness in her letter. Echo casts herself in a position of almost predatory power, controlling the entire meeting. And Byron, on the other hand, is like the damsel in distress, potentially afraid of walking in the park alone. Echo must have known that the chances of the aristocrat meeting a stranger in the park at a moment's notice were slim. And there's a sense that Byron's physical presence in this fantasy is almost irrelevant. By writing the letter, she's able to play the part of the mysterious, all-controlling Echo, and in a sense become the Byronic hero in her relationship with Byron. Echo's choice of alias is both humorous and revealing, as she invokes the classical tale of the imitative nymph Echo, who in Ovid's Metamorphosis only repeats the sound of others' voices. In this name, she not only asserts her own education and knowledge of classical literature, but also draws attention to the mimetic desire that permeates the fan letters. By placing herself in the position of Echo, the letter writer puts Byron in the role of Narcissus, hopelessly in love with his own reflection. On one hand, Echo is only mirroring Narcissus, yet the twist of Ovid's tale is that by repeating Narcissus's words, Echo changes their meaning completely. After Narcissus rejects her physical advance with the command, "Take off your hands, better death than such a one should ever caress me," Echo answers with the pitiful request, "Caress me." In the same way that Narcissus's statements are recontextualized in Echo's voice, so did the anonymous letter writers, in their echoing of Byron's own flirtations, create new meanings from his poetry. The flirtatious openness of Byron's poems allowed readers to interpret Byron's work in individual ways, using his poetry as a means by which to describe their own unique experience. The fan letter suggests that while reading Byron's poetry, readers not only identified with the feelings of isolation and alienation that the Byronic hero represented, but also imagined themselves in the active position of Byron's comforter or reformer. In this way, they were able to express their own problems and desires through the medium of Byron's poetry. So, I thought you might be wondering, how did Byron feel about these letters? Well, according to his friend Thomas Medwin, he was quite pleased to receive fan mail, as Medwin recalls the poet declaring proudly, "I'm always getting new correspondence. Here are 3 letters, just arrived, from strangers, all of them." Byron also wrote to another friend, Thomas Moore, describing a fan letter written in French and flattery that excited his curiosity. "Who is she, and what is she, and how came she to take an interest in my poetry or its author?" Part of Byron's interest in this letter seems to have been from his incorrect suspicion that the correspondent was Madame Sophie Gale of Paris, a successful novelist and composer. But despite a few women who piqued Byron's curiosity enough for him to investigate their identity, the majority of the letters in the Murray Archive seem to have remained unanswered. And indeed, the poet continually downplayed his popularity with young women, much like stars today. You know, if you think of someone like Harry Styles, who was previously very popular with young women, if they want to be taken seriously as an artist, they need to distance themselves from their sort of young female fans. Robert Charles Dallas, Byron's biographer, portrays Byron as having a somewhat detached attitude to his fan mail. In his recollections of the life of Lord Byron, Dallas describes a note that Byron left for him, which included a copy of verses to Byron with a letter beginning, "Dear Child Harold," expressing the greatest admiration and advising him to be happy. Neither the letter nor the verses are badly written, and the lady concludes with assuring him that though she should be glad to be acquainted with him, she can feel no other emotion for him than admiration and regard, as her heart is already engaged to another. Apparently, Byron jokingly suggested that the letter could be from Dallas's wife, but Dallas said, "None of my family would ever write an anonymous letter," showing us again that this type of letter writing was considered deeply indecorous at the time. Dallas adds bluntly, "Byron says he will not answer it." Even if Byron stated to Dallas that he was not interested in corresponding with his fan, the fact that he showed these letters to both Dallas and Medwin suggests that he was interested by them and flattered to have received them. Certainly later in his career, when he had long been living away from England and the frenzy of his years of fame had died down somewhat, Byron seems almost nostalgic for his fans. After what must have been a relatively long period of silence from his readers, Byron was delighted to receive a letter that reminded him of his earlier fan mail. He wrote to his sister on 7th of November 1822, "I have also had a love letter from Pimlico, from a lady whom I never saw in my life, but who hath fallen in love with me for having written Don Juan. Do you remember Constantia and Echo and La Suissesse and all my other enamorate, when I was gentle and juvenile, curly and gay? But I am grown very good now, and think all such things vanities, which is a very proper opinion at 34. His specific individual references to his fans, including to Echo, shows that his fan mail had a prominent place in the poet's memory. He looks back nostalgically, but he also makes it clear he has moved on. This letter was written just 7 months before Byron departed for Greece. Byron was living comfortably in Italy, but as he had throughout his life, was looking for his next adventure. The letter writers talk about wanting to save Byron's soul, and at this point in his life, Byron was perhaps wanting to save his own self, to do something that he considered truly meaningful. He was moved by members of the Greek independence movement and the London Greek Committee to join their cause, and, filled with a longing for the Greece of his past, he set sail in July 1823. Like a true celebrity, he didn't travel light. With him on his boat were 9 servants, including a doctor specially recruited, 5 horses, 2 small cannons, a store of medicines, 10,000 Spanish dollars in cash, and bills for a further 40,000. He also brought half a dozen military uniforms in many colours, all lavishly decorated with gold and silver braid, with sashes, epaulettes, waistcoats, and 2 specially made gold helmets. There's no doubt that Byron was seriously committed to the cause, but he always liked to do things in style. And in a sense, he knew it was this theatricality, that he was a rich celebrity with fans, that was the reason he was recruited. Some foreigners had already joined the Greek war, but Byron was by a huge distance the most famous. I think it's fair to say that his celebrity and wealth were his main contributions. From the outset, Byron used his fame to bring international attention to the Greeks' fight for liberty, inspiring ever more foreigners, who I think it's safe to say could be described as Byron's fans, to rally to the cause, both on and off the battlefield. And like the letter writers who used Byron as a way of describing their own situation, his involvement gave the Greeks a vision of their own struggle, that perhaps the most famous man in Europe believed in their cause. His embracing of the values of the Enlightenment determined the course of an uprising otherwise plagued by factions and civil war. Byron's prestige and celebrity meant that his decision to back Alexandros Mavrokordatos secured him as the frontrunner of the fractured Greek contingent and took the power away from warlords and towards an elected Greek government. We've already heard about his generosity. He literally gave everything he owned to the war. And this injection of cash was absolutely vital for the success of the Greek cause. And the wonderful John Pappas drew my attention to the fact that it was on April 17th, 1824, that's 200 days ago tomorrow, that the English corvette Florida set sail into the Ionian Sea, carrying an initial installment of £40,000 from the so-called First Loan of Independence, totaling £345,000 credited to the Greek government. Of this initial tranche, referred to as the Byronian allocation, signifying funds received within Byron's lifetime, an allocation of £18,000 was dispersed to the Greek government on August 1st, 1824. These funds were earmarked for the urgent rearmament of the Greek fleet. Empowered by this Byronian backing, the Greek fleet successfully defended Samos during the Second Battle of Samos and in the naval battle of Gerontos, asserting dominance in the Aegean against the combined Ottoman naval forces. Consequently, the Greeks thwarted Ibrahim Pasha and the Ottoman forces, which would have devastated not just Samos, but also Hydra and Spetses. Byron wielded his authority as chief commissioner of the First Loan of Independence to broker peace among the fractious Greek factions. He sternly warned that funds from the loan would only be released if internal conflicts ceased and their focus shifted solely to resisting the Turks. As a result, in a remarkable turn, also on April 17th, the same day as the Florida had set sail, the rebel forces, led by the 2,000-strong parliamentary warlords in Tripolitza under Theodoros Kolokotronis, capitulated peacefully to the 3,000 troops of the lawfully elected government commanded by Andreas Londos. A lot of his influence in the short time he was in Greece came down to the phenomenon I have been discussing in this paper: Byron's ability to forge connections with people he'd never met and, in effect, make them fall in love with him. When he passed away after contracting a fever, his devastated friend Pietro Gamba, who we've already heard from, who had joined Byron in the Greek War, recorded in his journal, "He died in a strange land and among strangers, but more loved, more sincerely wept he could never have been wherever he had breathed his last." Byron was loved by strangers throughout his life, so much so that they wrote to him unprecedentedly and en masse. He may have dismissed his fan mail as frivolous, but it showed that he had a tremendous, indeed phenomenal power to create that intimate connection with people. It meant strangers wanted to reach out to him, to care for him, to save him, and ultimately, to fight alongside him.